Okay. If you didn't pick up your exam last time, you can get it after class. What I want to do today is to keep going on this theme of new powers emerging at the end of the 19th century. We talked last time about the United States, and we talked about the expansion of the United States into the Philippines, the expansion of American territory to include Hawaii. We talked about Theodore Roosevelt's grand project to complete the Panama Canal. I should emphasize that not only did Roosevelt complete the Panama Canal through various, you might say, sort of underhanded means, but also Roosevelt in 1904 declared a policy that's come to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary. You know what a corollary is? It's like an add-on, or an addition, or an amendment to something, to an agreement. What he was dealing with was something that was called the Monroe Doctrine. Yes, George? What year? 1904. The Monroe Doctrine had basically been something in the early 19th century proposed by President Monroe, which in essence told European countries to lay off any more colonial adventures in the Western Hemisphere, that the United States was sort of now the power in the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt Corollary was a declaration by Theodore Roosevelt not only that European powers ought to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, but that the United States now had a role to play, as you might say, the hemispheric policeman. This applies directly to the control that he established over the Panama Canal. That is, the Roosevelt Corollary basically said, if there is instability somewhere in the region where America, where the United States is sort of, you might say, the one power, the sovereign power, then the United States has the right to go in and, shall we say, end that instability. It's designed specifically to protect the Panama Canal. But it will be used multiple times, this justification will be used multiple times from the 19-teens through the 1930s to justify American incursions, at times armed expeditions, to places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, several times back to Cuba. American soldiers, particularly American Marines, will be dispatched when there are hints of political instability, when governments can't pay their debts and seem to be on the verge of dissolution. American troops will be dispatched in order to, quote-unquote, keep order and stability. What it is by Roosevelt is this is a declaration explicitly stating that the United States is basically the imperial power in this region, and that if anything is perceived to threaten American interests, the United States has all the authority it needs to act. So the Roosevelt Corollary is, in a way, you might say, sort of the final piece, whereby Roosevelt has basically brought this Panama Canal into being and is now saying that having done this, the Americans are justified in protecting it by whatever means they choose, whenever they choose. So there's going to be a repeated history of American troops, American soldiers, being, even at times just briefly, dispatched to various places in the Caribbean and Central America, mostly in order to assure that friendly governments, that's the Roosevelt definition of stable, you might say, that friendly governments remain in power and that American interests are not threatened. So that's the final piece that I didn't get a chance to mention last time. But the Roosevelt Corollary is this sort of declaration that the United States, as the great power in the Western Hemisphere, has the authority, has all the reasons it needs to act to ensure, basically, that the internal politics and the internal situations of other countries in that region are stable. Any questions about that? So the last, as I said, so the last piece. Yes, Leah.
Sorry, what year was
1904, the Roosevelt Accord.
I have a question.
Yes?
How is it different from the Monroe Doctrine?
The Monroe Doctrine basically told Europeans to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt Corollary says that the United States has an explicit right to intervene now in the affairs of others. It wasn't just saying, you keep out. And now it was saying, you keep out, but we can go in to justify, or it justified American sort of incursions into various places in the name of geopolitical stability.
You can answer it anyway.
Okay. Other questions about this? Okay. What I want to talk about then is, or now, is Japan. A country whose own ambitions are going to bump up against those of the United States, particularly in the Pacific, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But before we do, let me ask you something. I'll ask you guys to just contribute something here. When you think of Japan, if I was to say word association here, what comes out when you think about Japan? What comes up? What comes to mind?
Tokyo?
Tokyo, okay. Samurai? Sorry?
Cherry trees? Cherry blossoms?
Hold on. One at a time. Raise your hand so I can get them enunciated here. Some people are sort of spitting. Pearl Harbor, okay. Other things. The atom bomb. Okay, again, we got to speak up so I can hear. Yes?
The whole, no, maybe that's way before.
Okay.
Kamikazes?
Kamikazes. Catherine? Isolated. What's interesting is a lot of these words that come up that talk about Japan, that are sort of fixed in our mind about Japan as this sort of, what Japan's always been about. These are in many ways inventions of, apart from the samurai, inventions of or products of the emergence of a very new Japan in the late 19th century. Japan in the late 19th century undergoes a very dramatic transformation. What we're going to be talking about today is the nature of that transformation. The surface level transformation and the question of just how deep this transformation in Japan goes. So that's what I want to sort of talk about today. We're going to talk about the emergence of another power, in this case Japan, and talk about the way in which it emerges, the way in which its rise to power is greeted on the international stage, and how these, in many ways, sort of set up what's going to happen in Japan in the first half of the 20th century. The rivalry between the United States and Japan, of course, is going to ultimately result in war, starting in late 1941. The seeds of that, of Japan's rationale for war, Japan's sense of why it goes to war, the nature of Japanese society that promotes this war. We've already talked about the American interests in the Pacific that are also at stake in this war. A lot of these have to do with the nature of the transformation that Japan goes through in the late 19th century. It's a transformation that I said operates on a couple of levels. It seems to change absolutely what Japan is. But the question is, what is the actual nature, what is the actual depth of the transformation? Is it on the surface, or is it actually something deep-seated as well? This is Japan in the middle of the 19th century. Japan had, since the middle of the 1600s, in essence, somebody mentioned did you say isolated? Japan had cut itself off from the rest of the world. Largely due to the arrival of Europeans in Asia in the 1500s. The Portuguese and the Dutch are the two ones with whom the Japanese have the greatest contact. In Japan, in the early 1600s, you have a very traditional, you might say, feudal society. One in which an aristocracy dominates land ownership. An aristocracy, therefore, dominates politics. The name for the aristocratic families or the term to describe the aristocratic families who basically have divided Japan into sort of different fiefdoms that they control is daimyo. D-A-I-M-Y-O. Daimyo. It's a name for this sort of clan or aristocratic kin group. In the early 1600s, not only do you have this sort of aristocratic control, but you also have a situation in which the Emperor of Japan has largely been reduced to the position of a functionary. Someone who's responsible for ceremonies, someone who lives not in what is basically the capital of Japan, up here in Edo, which becomes modern Tokyo, but down here in Kyoto, K-Y-O-T-O, which is the sort of traditional, ancient capital of Japan. We know a lot about Kyoto because in a very sort of strange incident, and perhaps one of the few incidents in which art historians have ever had enormous influence, during the Second World War, when the Americans were bombing lots of Japanese cities, a delegation of art historians convinced them not to bomb Kyoto because they said, architecturally, culturally, artistically, this place can never be replaced. So Kyoto was spared while much of the rest of Japan was firebombed in the latter parts of the war. The emperor has been reduced to a position of sort of just being a ceremonial figure. Instead, over the course of the Middle Ages in Japan, you would have the rise of a figure known as the shogun. S-H-O-G-U-N, the shogun. The position of shogun was technically, basically, the leading general, or the leader of the emperor's armed forces, the leader of the emperor's army. By the early 1600s, the person who held that position actually was the leader of Japan. That is, the aristocrats had, in essence, wrested power away from the emperor, confined the emperor basically to Kyoto, and various aristocratic families competed to hold the position of shogun. The person who was the shogun was the most powerful person in Japan. So you had, again, sort of fights between these dynasties, fights between these aristocratic families over who would have this position. Because the shogun was the person who controlled the most soldiers, had the most territory, had the most sort of economic and social power, the most political power. In the early 1600s, the shogun, or the position of shogun, is occupied by one particular family, the Tokugawa. T-O-K-U-G-A-W-A, Tokugawa. And in fact, the period from the 1600s through the middle 1800s is known as the Tokugawa Shogunate. Shogun A-T-E. Means the time in which the Tokugawa family occupied the position of shogun. The technical term used in Japan to describe this type of government where the shogun ruled. I realize this is a lousy screen and lousy setup here. It was called Bakufu, B-A-K-U-F-U, Bakufu, B-A-K-U-F-U, which literally means tent government. Tent government. What it really means is basically, yeah.
Sorry, I just have a question.
Yeah.
So the Tokugawa, is that how you say it?
The Tokugawa.
Okay, so what is the significance of that? 'Cause I feel like
They're the family, they're the dominant family in Japan, the dominant aristocratic family in the early 1600s.
And then did they make the Bafuku or whatever?
No, the name, the type of government you have is the one where the military leader, the person who has the title shogun, is the most powerful person in Japan. This type of government is known as Bakufu, which means tent government. It means that the power lies not with the emperor in Kyoto, but in the tent or the camp of the shogun. That is, it's basically, Bakufu is another way of saying military rule. What it is there's a position called shogun. Over the course of the Middle Ages in Japan, the person who was shogun became the most powerful person. That is, the shogun was the most powerful position you could have in Japan. And so, you have these families which fight to hold that position. In the early 1600s, that position is controlled by the Tokugawa family. And they'll control it for the next 250 years.
You just answered the question.
Okay. And this type of government is known as bakufu, to separate it from government by the emperor. In Kyoto, this is government by the military. It's a literally tent government, meaning power resides with the general in his tent, basically. In the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogun was very concerned because there were, well, not, lots, there were some Europeans showing up in Japan. Portuguese traders, Dutch traders, Christian missionaries. And for the Tokugawa shogun, the appearance of all of these people was not, he didn't see this as a sort of a good influence in Japan. Because Japan is a very strict, hierarchical society. The ownership of land, the control of land is sort of, the way in which power is understood. And these were potentially destabilizing influences. That is, more and more trade might enrich people in Japan who weren't landowners but got involved in trade. This is especially true in the southern islands of Japan. The introduction of Christianity, with its message of, in some senses, radical equality, that is, the equality of all before God, that seemed like it might be dangerous in a society where hierarchy and elite status remained important. So in the middle of the 1600s, the Tokugawa shogun kicks out all the Europeans, the missionaries and the traders. Japanese who had converted to Christianity are forced to give it up, or in some cases they are executed.
When did they kick out Christian missionaries?
It's around, I want to say it's around 1638. So this all happens in the 1630s, early 1640s. I want to say 1638 is the date that sticks in my mind for the expulsion of all the missionaries. The only people, no Europeans who are allowed to stay, are a few Dutch traders who live on an island off of the city of Nagasaki. And they're allowed a couple times a year to trade with selected Japanese merchants from the southern islands. That's it. So the Dutch maintain this trade station, but ultimately have very little contact with the Japanese except for at certain sort of prescribed times of the year when they can trade. The Tokugawa shogun is attempting, in essence, to wall off Japan from outside influences, to protect Japanese society as he sees it. That is, it is a way of protecting the traditional, hierarchical, aristocratic society that has been sort of the hallmark of Japanese history since the Middle Ages. Between the 1600s and the 1800s, Japan largely stays to itself. This area here is where the shogun directly controls. Further north of the island of Honshu and down into some of the parts of the southern islands, the shogun has allies. That is, other aristocrats, not as powerful as him, but who support his rule. Even further down, in the very southern islands, you don't have allies. You do have these daimyo, aristocratic families, who themselves are not powerful enough to take on the shogun and sort of have to accept his rule. They're not allies. In essence, they're sort of subjects of the shogun. These daimyo have specific family names. The most famous are the Tosa and the Choshu, the Heisen, and Satsuma. The other thing is that not only are they not powerful themselves to take on by themselves to take on the shogun and his allies, they oftentimes have lots of disagreements among and between themselves. So they don't really get organized very well. So you have a situation where you have sort of this dominance, aristocratic dominance, military aristocratic dominance, that lasts under the Tokugawa for over 2 centuries, until the 1850s. Everything's going to change in the 1850s. Because in the 1850s, the Americans arrive. In 1852, an American naval commander named Matthew Perry comes into, or sails into, Edo Harbor, what's now basically Tokyo Harbor or Tokyo Bay. And it's not by accident. The United States Navy had, since the 1840s, been pushing further and further into the Pacific, attempting to make, for the United States, more influence, or to gain for the United States more influence in the Pacific, to protect American trading interests. That is, American merchants did do a lot of business, bringing goods to and from China, also, to a lesser extent, to and from India. The Pacific, and the South Pacific in particular, were also where the American whaling fleet at this point was located. Having basically found and destroyed all the whales in the Atlantic, they had moved on to the Pacific. By the late 19th century, just about all of those whales will be gone too. But in the middle of the 19th century, there's still a significant whaling industry in the United States, and that's another reason for the Navy to begin to expand its influence in the Pacific. Perry and others in the Navy had identified Japan as a potential place for the American Navy to refuel and resupply and sort of take a break. That is, for America, while there was interest in America in sort of, shipping goods to and getting a greater relationship with Japan, at least the initial thought was that Japan was potentially a place that the American Navy could use, not even to establish a permanent base, but to have access so that the Navy could continue to be a formidable force, or could continue to grow into a formidable force in the North Pacific. In 1853, I apologize. In 1853, Perry sails into Tokyo Bay, or Tokyo Harbor. One of the first things he does, as he sails in, he makes an instantaneous impression upon the shogun and his advisors, because Perry's got steamships. The Japanese come to call them the black ships, because they're belching out all of this smoke as they steam their way into the harbor. When Perry and some of his crew present themselves on shore, the Japanese are going to be absolutely appalled by just how filthy these guys are. They've got beards, their hair is all matted, their skin is filthy, they've been at sea for weeks on end. In Japan at this time, in aristocratic culture, this is sort of a staged depiction of samurai in the late 19th century, people acting as samurai. In Japanese elite culture, facial hair, any sort of disarray was absolutely forbidden. You were clean shaven, hair combed, dressed immaculately. Perry and the others show up, and he's got these technologically advanced ships, but they look like cavemen. And there were Japanese artists who portrayed them, who sketched and painted Perry and his crew when they arrived, and they looked like these sort of barbarians. But at the same time, they had weapons, they had powerful ships, and by sailing unobstructed into this harbor, they had exposed one of the sort of defenses, you might say, that the shogun had constructed to keep people away from Japan. That is, around on the cliffs and hillsides around Edo Harbor, or what's now Tokyo Bay, there were these large cannons. They were made of wood, painted to look like, the shogun was armed to the teeth. Perry just sort of sailed right past them, at which point now they were no longer useful for anything, except maybe firewood. So you have this situation where Perry exposes the shogun. And Perry comes to shore, and he wants to make an arrangement with the shogun. Can the American Navy come here periodically to resupply, to refuel, sort of take a rest? And the shogun says, I'll think about it. And Perry says, okay, I'll be back in a year for your answer. And by the way, have you noticed these ships, and they're big, and they have, significant guns on them and everything? Just mentioning, I thought, in case you hadn't noticed. And Perry leaves. And the shogun's got quite a dilemma. Because he says, I can't fight the Americans. They'll just come blasting their way in. On the other hand, if I agree to this, who's going to say this is the only thing the Americans want? Is this going to be simply, the start of a process of winnowing away or whittling away Japanese autonomy?
What is it that Perry proposed to him?
He proposed an agreement whereby the American Navy could come and have the right to basically to resupply, to repair their ships, to use Japan as sort of a stopover place. Not to build a permanent base or anything like that, but just simply for the Americans to have access to Japan in the name of sort of giving the American Navy a reliable place to stop. So the shogun has this problem. He doesn't want to fight the Americans because he doesn't think that's going to be possible. But on the other hand, he knows that if he makes some concessions now, he may be setting himself up for further trouble down the line. And his advisors are split. Some say make the deal with Perry because otherwise we're going to get absolutely destroyed. Others say if you make this deal, you're going to simply start the process of Japanese decline. You cannot give an inch. The result in 1854 is that the shogun decides to make a deal with Perry. They sign an agreement. Perry's back in 1854. They sign an agreement. The American Navy can now have access to Japan. It's not an agreement to, for trade or saying they're going to build permanent settlements in Japan or anything like that. But for some around the shogun, this is too much. And when you get starting in the middle of the 1850s, is civil war in Japan. As the shogun and some of the shogun's former advisors and former allies fall out amongst each other and go to war with each other. That is the sort of about 30, 40 years ago, the way in which historians traditionally said this was Matthew Perry came and opened up Japan and showed them sort of how the modern world worked. And they loved it and embraced it and followed it along. No. What Perry does is basically Perry comes and provokes a civil war in Japan. A civil war which is fairly complicated because it's not just the advisors and the allies of the shogun fighting, but by the early 1860s, it's these guys in the south. They come to be known as the southern daimyo, or the southern aristocratic families. They see all this chaos up here to the north. And for the first time, in a long time, they organize among themselves. They unite. And they fight as sort of a unified bloc. And by 1867, they have conquered this area, forced the shogun to surrender, eliminated all, or basically vanquished, both sides of the conflict that was going on up here. Basically, these guys down here see their opportunity. After most of mainland Japan gets caught up in this sort of civil war over reaction to the Americans. So you have is this southern aristocratic coalition that by 1867 has taken over Japan. And these southern families have a very specific idea of what they want to do for Japan.
Did you say 1867?
1867. Basically around, it's by about 1855, you get sort of conflict breaking out around the shogun. By the early 1860s, you get these southern families jumping in to try and take advantage of the sort of instability. And they do. They're successful. And they have decided, they take over Japan, they take over from the shogun, and they say, we are going to plot a new course for Japan. They're still aristocrats, they're still elites, but they have a new idea as to how to protect Japan, how to maintain Japanese independence and autonomy. In that way, they were a lot like the Tokugawa shoguns and others who basically said, walling us off from the rest of the world is how we protect Japan. These new rulers, these aristocrats from the south, they say, or they have the same goal, protect Japan. They didn't take over Japan to open it up and say, who wants to come in, please do. But instead, they say, there's got to be another way, because the shogun's way didn't work. You can't put fake cannon up on some bluffs and hope that no one actually sails past them without any sort of consequence. So basically, what you have is these southern Japanese families organized amongst themselves who take over and then say, we are going to maintain the same goal. We're going to protect Japan from outside influences, undue influences. But we're going to do it in a very different way than the shogun had. They decide that they're going to do it not by walling off from the rest of the world, but by engaging the rest of the world. And not just engaging the rest of the world haphazardly or sort of, in a variety of undirected ways. These guys say, what we're going to do is we're going to become like the West. We're going to become, quote-unquote, modern. We're going to make Japan into a place that looks like Germany or Britain or France or the United States. And we're going to do that not only because we will build up our economic and military power, but also we will look like the West. That is, if we continue to sort of practice older ways, and they look at the Chinese as an example of this, we will be vulnerable. What we need to do is project an image to the West that we are not, in some ways, Asian, but we are like them. That is, project the Japanese culture, Japanese economy, the Japanese military, the Japanese political system are all, quote-unquote, modern. And are all very similar to those found in places like Britain and Germany and the United States. That's how you protect Japan. You make Japan into a new sort of state. You make it so the rest of the world will see Japan not as an Asian power, but almost as a sort of Western power. That's what they come up with. They say, this is the way forward. We can't hope to simply wall off the rest of the world. We can't be like the Chinese and pretend in some ways that this isn't happening. They've watched the Chinese be defeated by European forces in wars in the 1840s and 50s. Instead, the Japanese say, we're going to present ourselves as basically a Western power within Asia, so that we will not look vulnerable. It's a way of both saying, we will, if you want to take over from us, you're going to have to fight us. But it's also a way of saying that, establishing commonalities so you don't have to fight. But instead, so that you can ultimately be seen, at least in the Japanese mind, as on a level with these European powers. Yes?
So, was there a desire to actually really assimilate a different way of life, or was it more of just a facade?
Well, it's both. It's both. We'll talk about that. There's elements where they do believe that they have to industrialize, they have to build up the military, that's going to keep them safe. But they also believe very much that they have to project a certain appearance. That it's not just going to be about sort of military power and economic power, but it's going to be sort of appearing to the world a certain way that will keep them protected. And that's one thing we'll talk about. That is the appearance that they wish to project and the reality on the ground in Japan are at times two very different things. But the idea is, look like the West. Look like a colonial power, not like a place likely to be colonized. That's the key. And one of the first things that these southern families do is they say, in order to look like a place like Germany, we've got to get back to sort of a system of government, not where the shogun, this sort of medieval military figure, is in charge, but we've got to put the emperor back in charge. We've got to create an imperial Japan again, a real imperial Japan. And the emperor is delighted by this, because, of course, it means he's going to be back in power. Basically, these southern families support putting the emperor back at the center of Japanese government. Now, they're going to have a lot of sway over the emperor, they're going to have a lot of influence over the emperor, but they decide one way to look like the modern world is to have a figure like the German Kaiser, like the British monarch, at the center of Japanese life. And in 1867, there is, in fact, a new emperor in Kyoto. His name is Mutsuhito. M-U-T-S-O-H-I-T-O. Oh, sorry, there's an extra. Sorry, Mutsuhito. M-U-T-S-O-H-I-T-O. Mutsuhito. They are going to basically support him as the emperor. And he takes as his new name, his imperial name, like Hong Wu had done and others, the name Meiji. M-E-I-J-I. Which, among other things, means enlightenment. He's going to be known as the Emperor Meiji. This is him right here. One of the things that happens, or what do you say? What would you make of this appearance of the Emperor Meiji? This is from the 1870s. So he looks European. How so? He's got all the medals.
His facial hair.
He's got facial hair. Good point.
Shorter styled hair.
Shorter styled hair, yep. It's not wrapped up in a top knot or something like that, as traditional sort of warriors have done.
Not a samurai sword.
You're right, it's not a samurai sword, it's a very European sword. That's an excellent point. He's got the sort of hat with the feathers on it. I mean, he looks like he'd be sort of an admiral in the Italian Navy or something like that. This is not the way in which the emperor had traditionally been portrayed, but it's the way in which the emperor is now going to be portrayed. And Meiji takes it upon himself to promote this idea that Japan must now look very different to the rest of the world. Yeah.
So once again, the emperor is being used like a puppet.
Well, it's not necessarily puppet because there is this thing. I mean, the emperor still commands a lot of respect, but he's also dependent on these aristocrats for support. The aristocrats know that they don't have the family lineage, they don't have the history to lay claim to being emperors themselves. But what they're going to do is they're going to build up the position of emperor. But because they themselves are going to have such influence, they're not worried that the emperor is really going to take control. Yeah, it's not quite a puppet, but there's always going to be this sort of interaction between the emperor and these aristocrats who, especially, or well into the early 20th century, these aristocrats who will be sort of, propping him up and will occupy a lot of the key positions in the Japanese economy, Japanese politics, and in military. Yeah, Brittany?
So they kind of work as his advisors?
Yeah, there is advisors, there is, they form the imperial court, basically. And yeah, they are the ones, they're the ones responsible for the ceremony where in 1868 the former shogun gives his ceremonial sword to the emperor. He basically restores, this is why this is called the Meiji Restoration. He restores control of the military and thus basically restores power to the emperor. After several centuries in which the shogun held the power, because the shogun controlled the army, he now gives the sword, symbolizing control of the military, back to the emperor. The emperor's power is now fully restored. That's why this period, after 1868, is known as the Meiji Restoration. Meiji's the emperor, and his power, this sword, or not maybe this sword, but the sort of the ceremonial sword that the shogun held, that is now restored to him. Aaliyah, do you have a question?
Yeah, what does Meiji mean again?
It means basically enlightenment. And the emperor becomes sort of the public face of a campaign to westernize Japan, to encourage people to adopt Western fashions. What the Japanese are doing is that they decide in the 1870s and early 1880s, we're going to concentrate on starting to change how we look to the rest of the world. Meanwhile, we're going to send representatives to other parts of the world to find out exactly what we ought to do for our infrastructure, for our political system. How do we reorganize or sort of create industrial capacity? What technologies do we need? So while that is going on, this sort of process of investigation, in the 1870s, the real emphasis is going to be almost, you might say, sort of the public image of Japan. And you'll have paintings, depictions of street scenes that will emphasize, again, it didn't come out that well, but you'll see sort of European-style carriages, people wearing European-style hats and dresses. You'll still have some people in traditional Japanese wear, but you'll have this notion that that becoming Western is now the responsibility, especially of the Japanese aristocracy and the Japanese military. The vast number of the vast majority of the Japanese population is not really being affected by this. The vast majority of the population remains peasants. The thing that's going to change for them in the 1870s is that the Japanese decide, if we're going to have a modern state, we need to have a modern army, not rely on samurai or sort of mercenary warriors, but rather have mass conscription. And in the 1870s, they basically start to draft lots of Japanese peasants into the army. Many of these Japanese peasants are not thrilled by it. There are violent demonstrations. There's violence against these peasants. Eventually, you do get a mass army created by the early 1880s based on the forcible conscription of the countryside. And you'll have problems with food shortages because labor will be taken out of the countryside. You'll have protests about the rising prices of food, protests against this conscription. But ultimately, the Japanese military prevails. And so one of the first things you get by the early 1880s is a modernized army, by which the Japanese really mean sort of an army that's clothed in European-style uniforms. They bring over some European military advisors, and it's a massive army. It's no longer reliant on people from a specific warrior group, like the samurai, to fight. In fact, the samurai in the 1870s, late 1860s, early 1870s, they are pursued and, in essence, destroyed. Those samurai who had fought for members of the traditional aristocracy, they are now eliminated. They're identified, they're isolated, they're basically chased into the northern islands of Japan, where they're either killed or where they will die of disease or exposure or starvation.
Who pursued them?
The new government. The new government. They saw the samurai as basically this as an example of the old Japan and something that needed to go. Yeah.
So did the government, I can't remember what they call it, but when they take their own life with like a little dagger?
Oh, if they...
Did the government make them do that, or was that?
No, they would do that themselves. This is actually some of them would eventually kill themselves rather than surrender to this new government, but others sort of vowed to continue fighting, and they were ultimately sort of forced to flee to the north, where many of them simply died of disease and exposure. Tom Cruise does not rescue the samurai. Had Tom Cruise showed up, it just would have been an enormous lot of confusion. Yeah, you have basically a few samurai who are left, who are almost sort of treated like kind of, sort of cultural curiosities. And you'll have people who continue to sort of dress up as samurai. But once the samurai are sort of dangerous because their loyalties lie to a particular person or a particular aristocrat. They don't lie to the sort of the nation state. And that's what the Japanese want to do. Once they actually get rid of the samurai as an actual force, an actual group within the Japanese state, then what they're going to do is they're going to start to try to sort of generate a sense of, or to generate a sort of identity within the army, the new mass conscripted army that echoes some of the things that the samurai were known for. And to sort of create this ethos in the army of protection of the emperor, in the same way that samurai had traditionally been loyal to a particular master or to a particular aristocrat. Instead, they're going to sort of try and take some of these elements of samurai culture and use them to create a new culture in this mass army, this army of drafted, oftentimes unwillingly drafted peasants. But the actual samurai themselves, the signs of sort of pre-1860s Japanese culture are going to be at the least de-emphasized and at the most destroyed. The real stuff, the stuff that's not simply cosmetic or on the outside, that starts in the 1880s in a couple of different directions. The first is this. Japan in 1889 gets a new constitution that lays out the political structure and the political responsibilities of various groups within Japan. This is the ceremony in 1889 where the Emperor Meiji gives the constitution to the Japanese people, as represented here by these various elites from the military and the civil service. All of them are dressed in Western style facial hair. Japanese women did not necessarily get much of a break because they were, in some senses, told to get out of the very sort of ceremonial kimonos, which were enormously elaborate, that took hours to get into, that featured things like corsets and at times almost sort of boards in your back to keep your posture at a very specific angle. They were told, no, you need to look Western, therefore we're going to put you into sort of traditional Victorian dress, which requires more corsets and more petticoats and more hoop skirts and like that. So unfortunately for Japanese women, this sort of change in appearance simply meant they changed sort of one very uncomfortable garment for another. For men, it was this change into very westernized military dress. But there's something very important going on here that gives you an idea that the changes being made in Japanese society may not go as deep as they seem to. That is, for these aristocrats, for the people who supported the emperor, for the emperor himself, they wanted to remake Japan so that Japan could be safe, so that Japan could be independent and autonomous. They didn't want to have a complete social revolution in Japan. They didn't think, oh, the peasants should be able to vote. They didn't think, oh, we've got to open this up and have democracy, anything like that. These people had not fought in the 1860s to take control of Japan, simply to give Japan over to the actual, sort of mass of the Japanese people. They wanted to keep control. The question was, how do you keep control in a sort of traditional aristocratic way while looking to the rest of the world like you're no longer the Japan of old? And the key lies in the way in which the constitution, the political and economic structures in Japan are formed. In the first place, this is the emperor giving the constitution to the Japanese people. That's something very different from how, for example, the British or American constitutions are understood. The American Constitution is understood to be this enumeration of rights, of liberties, that are open to and that are basically almost sort of naturally given to all people. By being a person, you have these rights and liberties. No one gives them to you. The Constitution of Japan is a gift of the emperor. In some ways, the emperor is above the Constitution. He is giving the Constitution, and the implication is he can take it away. That he's above the law. The idea in Britain and America in the Constitution is that no one is above the law. The Constitution applies to all, at least in theory. In Japan, you don't go that far. In Japan, you have the gift of constitutional rights from the emperor. So the emperor is in some ways outside of the constitutional and political system. That's the first thing. Secondly, the political system that's created is one that's going to be dominated still by elite men. There's a Japanese parliament created. It's called the Diet, D-I-E-T. Only a small number of Japanese men are eligible to vote for representatives to the Diet. Again, it is dominated by the aristocrats, their friends, and their allies. You don't have a new democratic or radically inclusive Japan. So, in some ways, yes, we've got an elected government, we've got a parliament, look at all this. We've got a constitution. But, on the other hand, it's one that doesn't seem to include the emperor, and it's one where political rights and the ability to participate is very circumscribed, or are very circumscribed. Within the Constitution, there are certain things that further, you might say, sort of limit power to a certain number of people. The military, this is perhaps the most important element within this entire structure that's set up. The military is responsible, is answerable only to the emperor. The emperor is the commander-in-chief of the military. The parliament, the legislature, has absolutely no say over what the military does. The military is basically a force whose sole allegiance is to the emperor. So you have a parliament which can pass laws, but can't enforce them. The old question of, you and which army are going to do this actually applies here because they don't have the army. The emperor has the army. And the Japanese military, in its officer class and over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century for ordinary soldiers too, will be inculcated, will be sort of, infused with this message that their primary responsibility is to protect the emperor. So you have a military which is largely under the control of one person. And in fact, in the 1920s and the 1930s, there's going to be episodes of violence by the army against people who want to change the political system in Japan and want to limit more the power of the emperor. There will actually be political assassinations of people who want to change Japanese politics by young army officers in the 1930s, cause a huge outcry in Japan. But these officers will say, we are sworn to protect the emperor. If you're texting, please put your phone away. Thank you. You are sworn to protect the emperor. It means that the army is accountable to no one. And in fact, the emperor can basically prevent parliament from sitting, from actually doing any sort of work, because he has the right to appoint members of the military to sit in the cabinet, in the prime minister's sort of, small decision-making group in the parliament. If he doesn't appoint someone, parliament can't meet because there's no full cabinet. So if he refuses to appoint a military officer, Parliament can't meet. Parliament is almost entirely at the mercy of the emperor. But since most of the people in Parliament are supporters of the emperor, supporters of the system, it doesn't really matter. But you have ultimately a Japan where the elites who control the military, the elites who are allowed to participate in politics, and the emperor control everything. There is not a lot of political participation. There is not a lot of sort of openness in this system. Instead, you have a system in which, even if there's going to be changes to the diet, as there will be in the 1920s and 1930s, the position of the army will remain sort of outside of Japanese politics, and outside in particular of Japanese political control. The military and the emperor will operate sort of in a different sphere from the diet and the parliament. That is the parliament. So you have, in some ways, almost sort of, if not dictatorial powers, you have an enormous amount of authority and power given solely to the emperor through the way in which the army is controlled. Any questions about this? So while it looks like, you've got a constitution and a parliament, you've got a modernized army, on the other hand, you have an army which is not responsible to, cannot be controlled by the, you might say, vaguely democratically elected parliament. Instead, you've got an army which exists on its own. One thing that's important to remember is that, and I mentioned this with the fact that the army starts assassinating politicians in the 1930s, the army has this sort of special position, and the army is going to be very reluctant to relinquish it. One thing that means is that the army in the 1920s and the 1930s is going to be on the lookout constantly for reasons to sort of assert itself, not just in politics, but to assert itself in Asia, to sort of drum up good publicity for itself, to rally patriotic sentiments, because they view the best way of protecting their special sort of position in the state, the best way to protect that is to remain relevant, is to become sort of the focus of popular patriotism. It's one of the reasons why the Japanese in the early 1930s will start going to war in Asia. First in China, and then identifying other parts of Asia that they want to control. It's not the only reason, but the army has a huge vested interest in fighting wars. Because when the army's out fighting wars, people aren't questioning the actual role of the army in the state. They can divert questions or concerns about this imbalance in the state by rallying people to sort of, the cause of the defense of Japan. Yeah.
Did you say that they were mostly in Asia?
Sorry?
Did you say that they were mostly Asia?
Well, starting in 1931, they'll go to war in China.
Yeah.
After 1937, they'll expand it from northern China into the rest of China, into what's now Vietnam, and by the early 1940s into much of the rest of Asia. But at least initially, for the army, taking sort of war, taking conflict across the sea into northern China in 1931 is a way of deflecting questions, deflecting criticism of the role that the army plays in the state. So that's what, just important to remember, is that you have a military which is given a privileged position and which is going to be very reluctant to give that up. And will be looking for ways to sort of generate good publicity for itself, to generate sort of positive publicity and patriotic sentiment. A couple of other things just about this Japanese state that's set up. The Japanese also are going to industrialize. That is, not only are you going to look like you're industrializing, but actually industrialize. So you can produce goods for this army. So that Japan can become a trading nation within Asia. Not simply a consumer of manufactured goods, but a producer of them. Again, all of these things designed to make Japan look and act like a colonial power, not like a place open to colonization. And just as you had had advisors and others and representatives from Japan go out to other countries to look at their constitutions, to look at how they set up their militaries. One thing is that, for example, they sent a lot of representatives to Britain and came back and began to build up the Japanese Navy on the British model. The problem was that they sent the people interested in the Constitution to Germany, and they copied the German Empire's model of a Constitution, which is never, ever a good idea. The German Emperor had a similar relationship to his military that the Japanese Emperor will have. That is, what it ultimately was is the Prussian model, whereby the army is sort of a separate entity under control of the emperor alone. That's what the Japanese take. They don't take one in which sort of civilian control of the military or political control of the military is important, but instead they take the one from Germany. Because again, it allows them to appear, quote unquote, modern, but also to continue to maintain elite control. Same thing goes in the economic sphere. The government, the Diet, the military, the emperor, they all want to industrialize. But they don't want to open up a huge sort of economic free-for-all in Japan. They don't want everyone to decide to open a factory. They don't want lots of people, or lots of new wealth, to be concentrated in populations which hadn't been traditionally wealthy before. That is, they want to have an industrial economy. What they want to make sure, however, that only people tied to the military, tied to the emperor, tied to these aristocratic families, that only they benefit. Because if you throw it open, you'll start to have lots of people, perhaps, making money, and they will start to clamor to be included. They will start to call for reforms to the political system. So you've got to somehow have industrialization without having, like you have, for example, in Britain in the 19th century, industrialization producing this new class of, or this new sort of middle class or upper middle class who are getting wealthy off of owning factories and investing in railways and things like that, and then want to play a part in the political system. The Japanese don't want that. Political participation has to be very limited. So they set up a particular system. A system that relies on the creation of they're sort of like cartels. The name for these groups is Zaibatsu. Z-A-I-B-A-T-S-U. Zaibatsu. What a Zaibatsu is, it's basically a family or a collection of families who are given by the Japanese state basically the right to found and to build up certain industries. They're given all sorts of tax breaks by the Diet. They're given exclusive orders by the military. It's a way of ensuring that, technically anyone who wants to get into the industrial game can, but the game is rigged to favor certain groups. The Zaibatsu are, again, these sort of family groups that are favored with contracts, tax benefits, all these sorts of things, so that they will be the ones to industrialize. And therefore, although you'll have economic modernization, it won't threaten the sort of traditional elite social structure. The most well-known of these Zaibatsu is a family from one of the southern islands, which had been very close to one of these southern aristocratic families, had been involved in trade and shipping, and basically gets invited to take a much larger economic role. This Zaibatsu is known as Mitsubishi. They start out building ships. They're eventually given contracts and financial inducements to go into electrical goods. Ultimately, of course, they're going to go into automobiles. But this is how elite control over an expanding industrial economy is maintained. By making sure that the expanding economy is largely in the hands of a few. Not necessarily in the hands of the aristocracy or the military themselves, but in the hands of sort of trusted allies and friends of these groups. So you have a situation where Japan, by the early 20th century, is an industrial state with a modern army, with a modern-looking constitution, an active parliament. But underneath, what you'll see is that all of these institutions are controlled by a very small number of people, with ties to the aristocracy that helped sort of bring about the Meiji Restoration, people with ties to the emperor and the military, and the economy through the Zaibatsu. And it's a very sort of tenuous position that these elites find themselves in. Because on the one hand, they're trying to maintain elite control, but on the other hand, what they need to do to maintain that oftentimes can cause criticism in Japan, especially criticism of the political system. That is, by attempting to maintain elite control, they provoke calls for reform in the 1920s and the 1930s. By limiting economic opportunity, they cause calls for, they provoke calls for reform of the industrial sector. The biggest thing to take away from this is that there is, in essence, a small group of elites driving what Japan's going to do in the world from the early 20th century on. And who will have as their priorities their own position and the maintenance of their own position as their major political goal. What should Japan be? How should Japan act in the world? It should act in ways that will benefit these groups. The interests of the army, the interests of the Zaibatsu, the interests of the political elites, those are paramount. And so you have a very small group which is going to be making the decisions for Japan in the 20th century, but making them largely on the basis of what's good for them, not necessarily what's good for Japan as a whole. And they will be at times embarking upon, in particular, military adventures as a way of solidifying their control, as a way of reasserting their position within Japanese society. That is, when you get to the 1920s and the 1930s, you'll start to see that political elites, military elites, the people behind the Zaibatsu, the people who make up the Zaibatsu families, they will all jointly come to the conclusion that Japan needs to pursue a much more militaristic policy in Asia and in the world generally. Not necessarily because they view that as being good for all of Japan, but because they view that as being good for themselves. A way of solving potential problems, a way of seeing off political reform efforts, a way of sort of keeping pressure off of the kind of system or criticism, a way of sort of warding off criticism of the kind of system the Japanese have created. We'll talk a little bit more about this next time before we start to talk about European empires, but this is the thing important to remember. Japan changes, at least outwardly. But underneath in Japan, you still have elite control. And the ramifications of that, the things that these elites will need to do to continue to maintain control, are going to have a significant impact on what Japan does in the world after the early 20th century. All right, I will see you all on Monday. Is it Patrick? No. Logan, sorry. There you go.